Welcome everybody, my name is Tim and this is another Real Ideal Gear Review. And today we're out at Lake Como in the Bitterroot Valley in western Montana. And today we're looking at dive watches and the legibility of dive watches in more murky conditions. This isn't murky water, it's mountain runoff water, so it doesn't have a lot of sediment or a lot of algae in it, but it does have a little color to it. So we're going to take a look at the dive watches that we have today and see what the legibility looks like under these conditions and just make some quick judgments on basic legibility. The purpose of this video is to take these dive watches, these digital watches, and even a sport watch and put to the test their water resistance and quote-unquote underwater capability or capacity. What we're looking at mostly here, primarily, is the legibility. We're not going to get into whether or not these watches are useful or not useful for actual diving to depth when it comes down to several hundred meters. We're looking at just what do these watches do underwater as it relates to legibility. How clear is the dial? How clear are the indices? You know, is the lume, whether or not you want whether or not you need the lume, is the lume strong enough underwater? We're not going to test the lume. We're not going to get to that kind of a depth, but we're going to assume that any watch that has really strong lume would be a benefit underwater. And you'll start to see how that, for instance, lume, how that plays a role in water that gets more and more murky, if it's cloudy out, if it gets closer to dusk or the sun goes down. All of those characteristics will just amplify these features. So the whole point of this isn't to say this is the best dive watch. The whole point of this exercise is to look at the legibility of these dials underwater, even if it's just a handful of feet, and then extrapolate forward. All right, if you go deeper with this, or if you go into a lake with even more algae in it or more sediment in it, you have an idea of which of these watches handle those kind of conditions better than others. And there's certain qualities that will rise to the top, and you're going to see pretty quickly what those qualities are. And then also, you know, these features of a dive watch or a watch that can handle underwater use, those qualities that they have designed into it, whether or not they're actually, you know, moderately or reasonably useful. So let's get into this, and we'll talk a little bit about the qualities of the watches that are going into this, the evaluation process, and we'll move forward with each watch. It'll be a little bit choppy as far as the editing goes, but you'll get the idea as we go through this as far as the quality of these different watches and how they evaluate out. The qualities of these watches require that they have a 100-meter water resistance rating, that they have water-ready bracelet or strap, that they also have a dive, or sport, or digital watch style or design to them. And lastly, they're going to be viewed at arm's length, approximately 2 feet. The evaluation criteria is going to be clarity of the dial color, the clarity and contrast of the indices, the clarity and color of the handset that's on the dial, and then also the clarity and color of the bezel. And finally, lume, the strength and duration of the lume, which we're not going to test that as far as like how deep these watches can go. The ranking is going to go 0, 1, 2, 3, 0 being non-existent, 1 having ineffective but present, 2 minor limitations, and 3 it's a strength or very effective. So as we go through this, we're going to be doing this again focused only on legibility. We're not looking at whether or not these are you know, dive-ready watches and certified things like that. We're just looking at the impact of what water can do to a watch as far as legibility is concerned. The Pagani does a great job. It's a sport watch. It's not technically a dive watch, but it does have a 200-meter water resistance rating with a very clear, dark dial, so the clarity and contrast off the dial is excellent. The clarity and contrast of the indices is great. It's very easy to orient and know which way is 12. The handset is awesome. The hour hand is slightly larger than the minute hand. It doesn't have a bezel, so it's going to take a massive hit on that score. It's a sport watch. It's not supposed to have a bezel. And then also the lume. It is really bad lume. So as far as that being a good dive watch for nighttime or dark activities, it's pretty clear that it's not. So overall, the Pagani does a great job really of just, you know, snorkeling, water use. But as far as any kind of a serious dive of any sort, I'm not so sure that this is the watch for you, especially if you're using scuba gear because it doesn't have a timing bezel. But the Pagani does a great job. You can see here the water doesn't really affect your ability to see what the time is, and it's very useful. Next up we have the Zelos Hammerhead Bronze Frost Edition. Frost meaning that it has a full lume dial, which also makes the dial white. The easy part of this then is your contrast with your hands and the dial is going to be awesome. So the dial color is going to get a 3. The indices and the hands are all going to get 3s because they're all black. It's very easy to read the dial on this watch underwater. It doesn't really have any issues when it comes down to the legibility of this dial, the handset, and the indices, the orientation of the watch as well. The bezel is interesting because the first 15 minutes of the bezel is of a different design, and so the bezel is great for that reason. And then also the lume is outstanding. So this watch is getting an overall score, a perfect score, and it's in contention now for anybody to try to beat this watch as far as legibility goes. It's a great watch. The strap is great. Overall, this is a great water watch. The SteelDive Willard watch is another interesting watch with a yellow dial. It has the lumed white hands and the indices, which actually makes for some really complicated clarity issues. It doesn't have the real clarity necessary for the dial underwater. Everything gets kind of lost in that yellow color. The indices are also another one that, against the yellow, it's really hard to see the indices with the same clarity as some of these other watches. And the handset as well. Small handset, same issue, off-white color as far as that goes. The bezel action on this is great. The bezel is perfect, great number size, easy to read, high contrast, black on white, which is really the issue with the dial. It's not black on white. And then finally, the lume on this is awesome. So it rounds out the top 5 with 2 winners at the very end. So overall, the watch took a couple of major hits, 3 major hits actually, in the clarity and the legibility of the dial, the handset, and the indices. But I think overall this watch does a good job, especially if you keep it at the snorkeling level. I don't think this is an issue at all, but it is more of a design watch and not necessarily a water watch. The Seiko SRPD85 is really a good watch. It's known for its water usability. This particular watch, though, is brown in color, and so when you get the dial, you're going to have a lot of contrast with a dark brown dial. The indices are great, very bright, easy to see the 12 o'clock position. The hands are great. You have the arrow hands on the ends of the minute hand, so really easy to look at that. The bezel is where things get a little bit the numbers are kind of small, the contrast is not quite as good. And the lume, there's no lume on the bezel, so if you rotate the bezel in a lower light condition, you just don't know exactly where the bezel is on the timing function side. So it takes a massive hit on the score there. Overall, it's a good water watch, but it certainly is not a high-end water watch. The Citizen ProMaster Aqualand is clearly a dive watch. It has the pedigree, the design features built right in. The dial has a high contrast dial, certainly easy for that one as far as the score goes. The indices, very easy to tell the 12 o'clock position from the rest, very clear. Not an issue whatsoever. High contrast, bright white on a black dial. The handset is great, although you do have the depth readout and your historic depth, how deep you have gone. They can kind of get in the way, but overall it does a great job. The bezel is incredible. It's actually very legible with the color. It has an illuminated pip, and then also the lume on this overall does a great job. It has an awesome lume. So this watch hits all the marks, right up there at the top with a few other watches. You're going to see that at the end, that these watches that have really dedicated a lot of design features in for diving or for underwater use really rise to the top. The Phoebus Proteus is a 300-meter rated dive watch, and it has some strengths and some weaknesses. First, the strengths. The color of the dial is great, offers a lot of contrast against the indices in the hands, so a dark dial is awesome, gets a 3 on that. The indices take a hit because you don't know where 12 is, and if you turn the bezel at all, you're just not going to know where the orientation of the watch is. The handset, you're not having all the lume go all the way to the end, so you have actually shorter hands when it comes down to it. The bezel is great, it's simple, easy to read, and the lume is really good as well, so it finishes out strong. The Borealis Sea Storm GMT is a great watch, high contrast, great qualities, 300-meter watch. This watch is easy to read underwater. The dial color is strong black. You have white number markers on there. Easy to orient the watch, especially if it's in the lower light murky conditions. So the 12, 3, 6, 9 is easy to orient. The handset is a little bit thin. Could have been, I think, thicker and easier to read, or at least have the hour hand be differentiated from the minute hand. But the bezel is where this one struggles. Because it's a GMT bezel, not a big issue. It's just the way the watch is designed. Again, this is form over function, the design of this over the actual function of it being a dive watch. But the lume is outstanding. You can see the lume on the bezel on the dial is incredible. This watch scores high overall, and of course the GMT bezel is what dings this watch. The Signum Cuda full lume dial is an incredible watch. The orange color offers a high contrast, and it's surprising once you put it underwater how that contrast works with the hour markers as well. So you get a high contrast dial. I gave it a 3.1 because it's such an incredible color underwater. The indices are easy to orient and see. The 12 o'clock differentiates from the 3 and the 9. And then also the handset. You have the sword hands that are wide at the ends. You can see what the minute hand and the hour hand are looking like. The bezel is great. It's loomed, easy to read, very clear, and easy to set. And the lume, of course, is outstanding. This is a top contender. Seiko Samurai is a dive-rated watch. This watch has a great overall set of features because it is a dive-rated watch. So you're going to see that the dial has a great color to it. Black dial, white hands, white indices. You're going to get a lot of contrast with that black dial. The indices are easy to orient. You have the 12 o'clock position, the 6 o'clock, and the 9 o'clock position, easy to find on there. The hands, very, very well done hands. You got the arrow hand at the hour and the sword hand at the minute. It's just awesome. The bezel, it takes a hit because the first 15 minutes, when you look at the bezel, it's really hard to see the 5-minute increments on that gray marked off dial. The lume is good. Seiko's not known for awesome lume, but it is solid lume. So overall, this watch does a great job. The Casio Pathfinder triple sensor is really a surprise when it comes down to its usability underwater. This is rated at 100 meters of water resistance, so it does handle the water very well. The clarity and the contrast of the dial is outstanding. Because it has an analog digital dial, the analog part stands out really, really well. The digital, it's digital. The display, yeah, it's awesome when it comes down to it. You get both, the best of both worlds. The timer function, this is where it's pretty typical. It has an audible timer, just like most dive watches have. And then you also have the light or lume at the end. The light is pretty bland, but it also has lume too. So I'm going to give it a 2+. It has that feature when it comes down to having both, and it's a unique unicorn when it being an analog watch and a digital watch. The Casio Big Sky 736 is another winner when it comes down to being used underwater. It has 100 meters of water resistance. The display is really easy to read. It's nice and big, hence the name Big Sky. It has a really good contrast when it comes to a digital display, a little bit better than some other ones because of the darker numbers on there. So overall, the display gets a 3 out of 3. What I really like about this is the timer function. This has a vibration alert, so this gets a 3+ because this is something that you just don't get these on digital watches very often, that vibration alert. Casio has that on this model, and the light is really good on this watch as well. So overall, this watch scores very high as a water-friendly, water user type watch. The Casio WaveScepter is another solid performer. It has a lot of great features to the watch. Overall, the contrast of the dial is pretty much average when it comes down to a digital display. You'll see that the numbers here aren't really, really dark, but at the same time, they're better than they were years and years ago when digital displays were harder to see. The size of the display is where this is a weak spot. The numbers are too small. If you're looking at this underwater, and it's something that really it struggles with. It has an audible alarm, pretty standard feature there, but the light has a great illuminator in the background, so it does a great job illuminating what you have on the display. It's just hard to see the display. So this overall suffers from a size issue. The legendary Casio Square 5610U is a G-Shock that has a reputation second to none, but it also is fairly average across the board. The overall contrast is a little bit above average, not great, but it's certainly a little bit above average. The size of the numbers or the display itself, it's average. You can read it. I would like to see it a little bit bigger. This is one of those classic design features of the 80s that, if you were to make it now, probably would be bigger. It has an audible timer, pretty standard function for that. The light on this one is great. So there's no question that when you turn the light on, you hit the light button, that you're going to get a really, really nice bright display as a result. So overall, it's a good, solid performer, which is what G-Shocks are meant to do. It can handle its 200 meters of water resistance. It's an overall great water watch. All right, let's go through the overall impressions of these watches, the digital watches, the analog watches. and just lay out kind of, all right, we have the evaluations when it comes down to a more objective case. What about the subjective? What about the subjective blended in with just the uses I've had with them, and just how this all going forward could identify some watches that are better for the water than others as far as legibility is concerned. So let's take a look at the digital watches. The poorest performer was the WaveScepter, although it's really not that much worse off than the Casio Square, the 5610U. They both have a display issue when it comes down to the size of the numbers on the display. And I think that is something that you just have to consider when you're underwater and things get more murky and things are less clear. You get that distortion from the water itself at times too. So, and not only that, you've got goggles on. More than likely you're wearing goggles, or you're wearing some kind of a mask or something like that. So these issues they don't get better, they get worse. And so the WaveScepter, I think, is the lowest performer when it comes down to the digital watches. Is it a bad watch to use underwater or to use in the water like that for legibility purposes? No, it's not a bad watch. Matter of fact, it has a great illumination. It has great functions. It has the timer function. It's also radio atomic clock set. So there's some features about the watch that are just kind of outside of the water use of it that make it a very good watch. So you have to take the entire package of this. If you're looking for a great water watch, you're going to get a dive watch, or you're going to get a dive computer. I mean, what else would you use except a dive computer for those kind of conditions where you want to know what the time is, you want to have it very clear, you got all the bells and whistles for the alarms and everything else. So we're not doing that. We're going through the watches. So that's kind of the balancing side. The overall winner of this one is the Big Sky. The Big Sky, it really does a great job. It has a great display. The contrast, surprisingly, the number, the darkness of the numbers is not quite as strong as the WaveScepter, but at the same time, the numbers are bigger, and it has a vibration alarm. And I think that's really important, because you don't want to be reliant on an audible alarm in a situation where you got all kinds of water noises going on around you. The low performers on the analog side, no doubt the Pagani was up against some titans, but at the same time, I think the Pagani really shows that a sport watch can handle underwater conditions in a very strong way, with the exception of it doesn't have a bezel. At the same time, Lume, the Pagani, when I did the review, check out the review on this watch, the Lume, if this watch had anywhere near average Lume, it would be an unbelievable watch on the overall objective scoring side of things. But the Lume is terrible. It just absolutely is horrid. And so when it comes down to low light conditions, it just doesn't last very long. It lasts literally 10 minutes, maybe 20 minutes. So it's just horrible along that line. Another low performer is the SteelDive. The SteelDive, as you can see, when you have a design that is more about the fashion, I shouldn't say fashion, it's more about the look of the watch and not necessarily the function of the watch. You can see how that underwater, the watch will start to struggle. And this is just a handful of feet underwater. You start to see how the dial and the indices and the hands start to work against the overall design features. So great above water. On land, it's a great looking watch. I love the watch. It's actually one of my favorite dive watches, especially for the price. But as far as the function of it underwater, it really struggles. Your top performers really are going to be the Hammerhead, the Aqualand, the ProMaster Aqualand, and the winner of this whole thing is the Signum Cuda. And the reason for that, now those three all got 15 out of 15s, but the Signum Cuda, when you look at this watch underwater and you see that orange dial, it is really, really difficult to not say that dial stands out more than a black dial does. And this is, I think, evidence to Doxa and the work that they did in researching what dial color is the best color for underwater use, and they came up with an orange dial. And so it also kind of lends itself to the Aqualand when it comes down. It's more of an orange bezel on the Citizen ProMaster Aqualand. And so that bezel really stands out. And so when you see these features like a really kind of a burnt orange or a bright orange feature, underwater, it really does stand out more so than a dark black dial does. And clearly the handsets, when you look at watches with a handset, you want to have, in particular, an hour hand that differentiates from the minute hand. You also want to have a minute hand that's big enough to see. The Borealis, it's just a really thin handset. If it was a little bit bigger, that would be great. The other watch that struggled was the Phoebus Proteus on the handset, because the white lume that they have on the handset doesn't extend all the way out to the tip of the minute hand or the hour hand. So it's actually underwater, it looks smaller and more compact as far as the handset is concerned. And then again, legibility, orientation, the Proteus really struggled with, you don't really know where 12 o'clock is, especially if you turn that bezel and you're timing something. You could be off by an hour either way just by the orientation of your wrist. So having something that really differentiates 12 o'clock from everything else sets the watch up for a better orientation overall. So the winners of this are the Signum Cuda, does an outstanding job across the board, and also the Casio Big Sky 736. So there you have it. This has been another Real Ideal Gear review on the legibility of watches underwater. If you have any questions or comments, please put those down below. If you have any ideas of watches that are similar to the ones I've shared or ones that I've totally missed, share them with everybody here. We'll comment it. I think I've gotten to every comment thus far. I really do like to spend time and interact with everybody who spends time watching these videos. And so if you have any ideas on these kind of watches, let me know. If you have any future ideas, let me know as well. This has been Tim. This has been another Real Ideal Gear review, and we'll catch you next time.